Hi friends, today I'm going to demonstrate how to use pastels to create a wave. I'm starting off with the rule of thirds sketched on my ampersand pastel board. I'm using a lighter colored pastel to sketch the big shapes of the wave and show the composition. You always want to keep the horizon pretty straight, so use the side of your pastel to make a straight line. Now that I have the composition with the rule of thirds and the intersections of the lines at points where it looks like they're focal points, then we're good to go. I'll start the painting. This is almost always how I start my paintings, using the rule of thirds or another composition device. Plus, I do a value sketch and a color study. Here's the original photo. You can see how the rule of thirds intersections are important. I'm going to start working from dark to light in this photo. The palette I'm using is orange and blue. I'm starting off with the darkest blue I have, which is a blue violet. This is an intense blue, and I encourage you to find one that's super dark. It's for the dark parts inside the waves. Now, I'm making it a little bit darker because dark colors come forward, lighter colors recede. So that helps to create the illusion of perspective. Next, I'm adding a little bit of that dark in the middle ground. This is just to carry that pattern of darks through the whole composition. You'll notice the horizon in the photo looks very dark. This is a trick of the camera. I don't want the horizon to be the darkest or sharpest line here. I want the edge of the wave overlapping the sand to be the darkest sharp. These are three different colors, or values actually, of teal, of blue-green. And I'm using all three of those in the wave. I'm starting off with the darkest value to create the texture and the darks in the waves in the background. It's a dark blue-green. You can see where that dark is on the reference photo. Next, I'm going to come in with some of those beautiful middle teals. These would be values maybe 4. This one is not quite as dark as what I just used. I'm using the side of it and pushing it deep into the tooth of the support. You can see how rich that color is. I want that richness to show through. This is the darker part of that wave. I'm also going to pull that color throughout the composition in other places. It's going to be behind the curve of the wave. And ultimately, it's going to be up at the waterline as well. I'm going to pull some of it right behind the wave here. That makes the wave come forward. Now I'm using the whole side of the pastel to get a straight line for the horizon. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight, but the straighter the better. We don't want it to draw the eye too much, but it is the only architectural line in the whole composition. Now I have blocked in the color of the water. This is the big overall mass. I'm using Mount Vision pastels. This is a blue-violet pastel. It's part of the blue family, but it has enough violet that warms it up. Warmer colors come forward. Cooler colors recede. This is another trick to creating the illusion of perspective. So I'm putting some of that purple in the foreground. I will pull a little bit of it into the middle ground, into the wave, just to create color harmony. But I don't want to overdo it. This is one step lighter. So the color I just used is on the left. This is the color for the sky. It's an ultramarine blue, which has a little bit of purple in it. So when I apply it, it does give you a sense of color harmony, but it also pushes the sky into the background. So I don't want the sky to compete with the foreground, so I want it to be much lighter and a different texture. But I am bringing that beautiful blue-violet light color into the froth and the crash of the crest of the wave. As I pull it in, I'm keeping the shape of the foam. This is the underside of the foam. Look at that rich color. It's already giving you a sense of perspective. The strokes I'm using are blending, so I have just used scumbling all over it by dragging one color on top of another. Now I'm blending by gently working that pastel down into the tooth. This fills in any texture or paper showing through. I don't want the tooth to show through in the background. I want it to look like it's the background. This creates a texture difference between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. I'm also getting rid of that hard edge of the horizon, and I'm just taking one finger, very lightly working the pastel together so that the line isn't perfectly architecturally hard. This will be more of a lost edge, pushing it to the back. You see how that creates the illusion of perspective? Texture is another method for creating perspective. Next, I'm coming back with a dark green, blue-green, and I'm going to use it to create the illusion of waves. Now, waves, as they near the horizon, are just very thin lines. As they come closer to the middle ground, those lines get thicker and spaced further apart. In the middle ground, which is where that first curl of the wave is, I want to make sure I have some intense dark right underneath the curl of the wave and in the center part of the shadow of the wave, where the wave is pulling out over, cresting a little. Next, I'm coming back in with a sky color, and I'm putting some sky reflection on the water, not in the same place as the dark. I'm moving it into different places, taking into account that the waves are going to be very thin close to the horizon and spaced further apart and a little thicker towards the middle ground. Next, I'm using pure cobalt blue. This is a very intense blue, and that intensity I'm exaggerating, as we in Texas like to say we're kind of telling a tall tale. I'm also making some linear strokes using this blue. This blue is going to help punch up the color, also the perspective, because that intense blue is a cool color. Warm colors come forward, cool colors recede. So it's going to help to push those waves back in space. That beautiful, cool blue is the darker color right behind the froth. This is going to make the froth pop, having that intense blue behind it. Already your eye is registering many different blues, and it's beginning to come together. Pure blue. I often use a complementary palette, so I use several different versions of blue. This is the lightest version of blue-green. It's a teal. Now, if you happen to have it in an iridescent, you get extra credit because that iridescent will give a little sparkle to the top of the wave. If you don't, just using a lighter teal helps to create some shape and form to the wave. It also helps to create some depth to that water. So I'm judiciously putting it in. This is an intuitive feel just to get some texture and shape in the water. You can see now that it has a lot more dimension to it. And that's with using the lighter version of teal. I'll keep that color in my VIP seating for later. This is the lightest light in teal. So it's a white that has a little bit of teal in it. And I'm using it for the froth and the foam on the wave in the middle ground. Now, I don't want this wave to be brighter than the one in the foreground. So I'm using something that's a little more bluish, and that'll keep it in the middle. I'm making marks with the edge of the pastel to give the texture and shape of that froth. I'm bringing the same color into the foreground to create dimension, but it isn't the main color for the froth in the foreground. That's still the white support showing through, but you can tell how the lighter light helps to bring it forward. Now, I'm going to judiciously blend, which means just a tiny bit. I'm using the side of my thumb. I'm pulling the pastel down, and that creates the curve on that edge of the wave. You don't want to overdo this. Do it one time. You have one shot. Keep your thumb clean when you do this. I'm lightly touching here and there just to clean up any loose edges. And I'm not going to do much else to the middle wave. I'll add some of the color as I go. Instead, I'm going to focus on softening that purple, that violet, blue violet in the front. So I want that to look more like the shadow underneath the wave as it crashes and less like a rock. Now we're moving to the hard pastels. These are hard new pastels. This is a cordovan color. It's a brownish. It's a wonderful warm color to go in the foreground. This will be the shadow edge where the wave is overlapping the sand. It's also very wet sand, so the next color I'm using is more of a golden ochre, a yellow ochre. And I'm using it for the parts of the sand that you see through the water. I'm exaggerating the color, warming it up a bit, just so that those shapes come forward. Notice that the shapes, the marks I'm making are all horizontal. You want them to lay flat. This is in front of the wave. It's the flat sand of the beach. So keep your marks very flat here. Keep the shapes flat. Also, don't let them become a pattern. You don't want them to be too uniform. You want them to lay flat and be very random, like a random pattern. These are two soft pastels. They're taupe colored. They would also work just as well for the sand. So feel free to use those if you don't have the same colors in hard pastel. Since it's a first layer, hard pastel will work really well. And then you layer your softer pastels on top of the hard pastel. Now the sand is in place, but we need to put some of the froth and water on top of the sand. So I'm moving to two colors. One is a very light teal that I used in the background. The other is a very light sky blue, like an ultramarine. It's a little bit lighter than the teal, so I'm putting some highlights on that wave in the middle ground, and I'm bringing that same color forward into the froth in the foreground. This helps to build up layers and texture. Notice I haven't used any pure white yet. I'm just using color temperature at this moment, and this particular one is a cooler, bluer form of white, and this helps give dimension and shape to that froth. We want it to look like frothy water. The motion I'm using is a daubing motion to apply the pastel. I'm banging the pastel onto the surface every time I apply this. This really pushes the pastel down into the tooth and creates yet another texture. Look how rough that texture is on the froth. That brings it forward. It creates that sense of motion in the wave. So I'm daubing that color on very strongly with my hand. Towards the bottom of the wave, I'm making splashes by using the side of the pastel, grinding it into the tooth and lifting up in short, quick motions. This helps to create the splash effect when the water hits the surface. It's already beginning to look like a crashing wave. Now I'm using that same color pastel to make the froth on the wet part of the sand. This also helps to lay the sand flat. Remember to keep your strokes horizontal here. That makes the water lay flat right underneath the wave. Much, much better. This can also help break up those shapes, so if you start to see a pattern forming, use the froth to help break it up, make it more random. If you overpaint too much of the sand, you can always come back in and negative space paint some of that wet sand back into the composition. That's what I'm doing here. I want to have enough sand for it to read like sand. Now, I'm adding a little bit of a highlight. This is with the lighter teal color. I have already two different values of froth. One is a light teal, one is a very light sky blue. So those are all in place. I'm using the very edge of the pastel to help create a different texture. Now, I am finally going to use pure white. I know that's a real challenge to put off using pure white until the very end, but I'm going to use it 3 different ways. Yahoo! The first is I'm using the stick I'm using is actually a very big white pastel stick. It's for painting on the street. I got it from Mount Vision. It's one of those you can't really order online. And I'm using it as a last layer here. So I'm putting just a little bit of texture in the foam with this white pastel. I'm using the face of it because I've already filled up the tooth on the surface, and I just have enough tooth left to grab a little bit off the top. I'm also using it on the froth, but the main reason I'm using this huge pastel is because I can splatter paint with this pastel. There's 2 different ways to splatter paint when you're using pastel, and one is with a toothbrush and alcohol. I'm using this seashell to hold the alcohol. I'm pouring just a little bit of alcohol in that shell, Putting the toothbrush in it, any kind of a shallow device, a spoon or something will work. I rub the alcohol-covered toothbrush on the pastel, get a lot of pastel onto the toothbrush, and then pull those bristles toward me. I'm paying attention to where that froth should go and pulling those bristles toward me. If it comes off too fine, just dip it in the alcohol again and pull it towards you, and the mist and the froth will start to come to life. You see how those little splatters of pastel really help to create that illusion of froth and mist. I learned this particular technique from Lana Ballett, who's an incredible pastel painter and specializes in waves. You should check out some of her waves. Google her. I'm adding froth all in the front. I don't really need to put it in the middle ground. I want to keep it in the foreground. You wouldn't see the froth as clearly in the middle ground. That's why. No splatters are needed. If you overspray, you can just touch it with your finger and it'll go away. I'm putting the froth in the middle ground by using just my finger. Next, I'm dusting using a razor blade on the dry part of the pastel. Dusting takes bigger chunks off the pastel and sprays them onto the painting. It won't stick unless you apply something heavy to the surface. So I'm pushing down with an ampersand pastel board. This will grind that pastel down into the surface and make it hold in place. You could also spray a little fixative, but that would darken it. Thank you for joining me weekly for pastel classes.